Welcome to the Fully Human Connections podcast. I'm your host King, and I'm joined with my co-host Reggie. How you doing today, Reggie?
I'm doing well, King. Always good to be here with you on a Wednesday morning. So I definitely cannot complain.
Well, the feeling is mutual. Feeling is mutual. Well, we like to get started by saying our gratitude moments, and I'll go first and say I'm grateful this morning for my life, my health, my ability to see, hear, walk, talk, stand, breathe, and have a sound mind. For another 24 hours to pursue my purpose in life. For my mother who's alive and healthy, a sound mind, roof over my head, and the infinite possibilities that this day is going to provide.
Yeah, Thank you for that. I'll go with my standard up front, and then I'll add to it. I'm just really grateful to um, be in a house that has indoor plumbing and a refrigerator with electricity that has mostly fresh food in there that I can get a hold of pretty easily. And I know that makes me uh, actually a minority on the planet. To have that much access to food and so I'm grateful for that. I'm grateful for the ability to get up in the morning and have a body that mostly functions well. And I'm also grateful, as we move forward in our conversations, for people who are beginning to, in a kind of slow process for me, but people are beginning to reach out and be in conversation about the book that we're talking about, and even comment as they are reading it and letting me know what they think. So I'm grateful for that as well.
Excellent, excellent.
Yeah.
And as we speak about the book, why don't you set the context for our discussion today?
Yeah. So we're speaking about a new book entitled, I always like holding it up, Healing America's Narratives, the Feminine, the Masculine, and Our Collective National Shadow. And there's a little tagline under the subtitle that says, Becoming More Fully Human. And this came out in actually right at the cusp of September. So it's been out just about a month now. And what we're speaking about basically is we've been going through some of the chapters and just remembering as you and I know, it's really easy to go down the rabbit hole of a current political conversation, especially with the elections coming up in the US as they are in 2 weeks. But we're really focused on, what the book talks about is healing these narratives, these competing narratives. And the idea that one way, I would argue that one essential way or means that we need to embrace to heal these narratives is to recognize, own, and begin to integrate the collective national shadow, those parts of America that historically and currently tens of millions of people either don't recognize or choose to ignore. And so we've been, focusing in on that. And for last week we began speaking about something we're going to go forward with is really identifying the manifestation of some of the elements of that shadow. And there are 9 of them. I can usually get 7 or 8 out without having to look, but they include ignorance, arrogance, bigotry, fear, violence, greed, excess, bullying, and untrustworthiness. I actually got all 9. That was pretty good. Proud of myself. So, and again, we're not saying that America is all of those things, but we're saying that is the country, as every country does, as every individual does, as every organization does, has a shadow, a side that is repressed and denied. And until we, really take a look at our ignorance, arrogance, fear, bigotry, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, we're going to continue working from a current map or several current maps that there is an abundance of evidence nowadays doesn't work. It's not working. Works for a handful of people, but not for most of the population. So we're concerned with this country, its direction, and we take on the entire political spectrum in our conversation. So it's not left. We're not taking a left-hand stance against the right or a right-hand stance against the left. We're looking at what is as best we can, what's true, and doing our best to begin healing process behind that. So that was little bit of a longer intro, but that's what we're doing.
Okay, excellent.
Yeah.
Well, for the first time, a question popped in my mind when you were reading through that, and that question was, I'm wondering why you chose the term "healing America's narratives" as opposed to changing America's narratives.
Yeah. So yeah, I think I've spoken a little bit about healing, but we've never addressed that question directly, and I really appreciate the question. So for the last more than a decade, and probably for the last 20 years without knowing it, 20 years ago, I used poetry writing and writing in general, both for myself and for students. And by students, they were both in schools and adults, to explore their lives through writing. And what I discovered, and I didn't really discover it, just like Columbus didn't really discover America. What a lot of people already knew was that writing is a wonderful tool for healing. It's not the only tool. There are lots of tools out there. But as students and other adults wrote their poetry or wrote their essays, they began to feel that they knew themselves better and they were better able to come to terms with their lives. So to the point of your question, when I used the way I use the word healing in the title of the book and throughout the book, it's different from fixing or curing. And it specifically means coming to terms with things as they are. So if we use a medical example, if I am clumsy and I fall down the stairs and I break my arm, and even the way I said that, I just made that up now, but even the way I presented that was unskillful. If I'm clumsy, so I already began criticizing myself. So if I fall down the stairs and break my arm, all right, more than likely the curing of that, fixing the broken bone, will involve the medical community and probably an orthopedic surgeon who knows how to do that. I don't. But the healing begins to take place as soon as I accept in my life that things are going to be different for the next couple of months or however long it takes. So I'm going to, especially if it's my right arm, because I'm right-handed, I have to change how I do some things. And the sooner I can accept that, coming to terms with the truth, my arm is broken. Not the end of the world, but it's, at the very least, it's an inconvenience, painful. Then I can really begin to work on changing the break, fixing it, curing it in medical terms. And those two things can be exclusive from each other. So I can get my arm fixed by the orthopedic surgeon without coming to terms with the fact that for the next 2 or 3 months, my life is going to be different because I have a broken arm. And the healing is more of an interior process. The curing is more of an exterior process. In other words, you can see the break. I can feel the change in how I can use my hand and my arm. But the healing is my view. It's what I'm able to see. So in our country today, the first thing we need to do is come to terms with things as they are. And there are many people in government, in the media, outside of government in the media, who refuse to do that. They have certain little versions of their truth that exclude other, I would say, more inclusive truths, things that can be proven, things that you can see, and most reasonable people, regardless of their political affiliation, would agree with. So I believe that healing America's narratives is a necessary step if we're going to revise them in a way that's, I'll just say more accurate in terms of what's true. So that was a long response, but I think it's a really important distinction to make. Can I give you one more example?
Absolutely.
So a colleague of mine, somebody who went to the same coaching school, Integral Coaching Canada, some years ago, I didn't train with her. but she's no longer with us. She died in May of 2016. And well before I met her, she was diagnosed with multiple myeloma, which is a very, very, there's no cure for that. It's a form of cancer, and there's no cure for it, but there are treatments for it. And she was given like a 6 months to 12-month prognosis that would, she wouldn't have a long time to live. And that was before I ever met her. From the time I met her, and I had nothing to do with this, but she lived, I knew her for 5 years, and she ended up living about 11 years after her diagnosis. She did every experimental treatment they had in Canada. She's from Canada. And she was this remarkable woman who would just show up in conversations, telling you about her most recent treatment. And she would apologize because the drugs were having different impacts on her. But she had this great kind of joy and appreciation for each day. And so she really came to terms with things as they were in her life. She had an incurable disease that was, well, as far as they knew, it was incurable. But she healed. She was in a constant state of healing. So she wasn't walking around morbid or upset or angry at the world or angry at God or angry at the medical community or whatever it was. So when she died in May of 2016, she was not cured, but she was definitely healed in terms of how I use that word. She had come to terms with what was true in her life. She accepted it. And again, you and I have spoken about Viktor Frankl. Everything can be taken away from somebody except the freedom to choose your attitude in a given set of circumstances. That's healing for me. So that's what, Jill Lang Ward did. And it was great because a group of people we used to meet together, we used to have these coaching meetings once a month. And you wake up with a sore throat, or you sprain your ankle, whatever, and you get on a call with Jill, and suddenly she didn't know she was doing this until we told her. But no one's going to complain about a sore throat with Jill on the call because she's this great spirit, stepping into a really difficult way of being in the world with her cancer, multiple myeloma, and she'd complain some days that she was struggling with the drugs or whatever, the treatments. But, that's, being fully human, these fully human connections that we talk about. So that's an example of healing absent curing. The ideal is to get both, whether it's a medical situation or a political or a cultural situation, the fixing and the coming to terms. But I would argue that very often the curing isn't going to take place. The changing won't take place without the healing first.
Okay. Well, thank you for clarifying that.
Yeah.
I know your book is written from a historical perspective. You talk about 5 different instances in the past, from women to civil rights to the war to talk about Native Americans and the plight that they had as well. And my question now would be, and looking at the historical perspective of where we've been, and you say these are the American narratives that we need to heal. Where do you see how that fits where we seem to be so polarized now? You believe that those issues create the polarization of the historical things we went through, that create the polarization where we are right now? Because where we seem to be right now, and if you listen to the news for even 5 minutes, it just makes you feel hopeless, which is why I don't like to listen to certain news broadcasts, because of constantly what they're painting. And just real quick, like, for example, the elections coming up, as we talked about before, as you mentioned. Well, several key elections, Arizona, what's happening in Georgia, what's happening in Florida, now, depending on what media station you listen to, they both perpetuate fear.
Yeah.
Like, if you don't get out and vote, this is what's going to happen.
Yeah.
So now my question, with that context being said, use the term coming to terms as a way of discussing healing. So since these polarizations haven't really come to terms where we are, there's no healing that that's beginning. Is that correct? We're becoming more divisive. Would you say, or would you not say?
For the mainstream media and the political, I would say everything. Local politics are probably healthier in certain places than national politics. I mean, that's kind of a sketchy thing to say because I only know local politics locally from where I am. Not that there aren't disagreements, but I think it's not as polarized. There seem to be more reasonable people, in certain local municipalities than there are at the national level. But yes, in terms of conventional media and what's going on in Washington D.C. on both sides of the aisle, it's increasingly polarized because everybody's afraid to lose power, and that comes back to money, and it comes back to I would say unchallenged belief systems and partial. The language I like to use is partial truths. Some people say something that's true and it's unequivocally true, but it's said out of the context of other truths that kind of, that are paradoxical. In other words, both of these things are true at the same time, but they only play with the part that serves them. And I would argue that a requirement, if you want to be a functional adult, a fully human adult in the 21st century in the United States and elsewhere as well, but we're speaking about this country, to be able to hold paradox. You need to be able to hold competing thoughts and apparently contradictory ideas at the same time and be able to be with that as opposed to a constant state of right and wrong. And again, that's not to say that there aren't some clear instances of right and wrong.
Right.
But there are some, truths that lend themselves to different opinions about how they can best be manifested. And that's what seems to be gone in the polarization of both the media and the federal government. That they just, if you disagree with me, you are un-American. It's no longer we're disagreeing. It's, you don't belong in this country if you disagree with my viewpoint. And that's probably, I was of Vietnam draft age. So I grew up I was born in the 50s, grew up in the 60s and 70s, and, lived through the 80s. And, you joined, a decade or so after that, I believe, after me. And we've seen it really bad, but it's about as bad as I've ever seen it now. So there are people, and I would like to think that you and I and some of the guests that we have on are among them, and people that you work with in Baltimore City and people that I work with. Most of my work is online now and cyber work. So I work with people around the country. There are some really good people who are able to see not just both sides of an argument, but I would argue all the sides of an argument, because we're stuck in that binary Republican versus Democrat, left versus right, liberal versus conservative. And that's a really limited view of the world. There's only two choices. So yeah, it's a major problem if you look at the people who have the biggest platforms, mainstream media and the federal government. It's horribly polarized. And as you said, right now, the number of emails and snail mail things I get telling me who to donate money to and, who's right and who's wrong is crazy. And it's an uncomfortable time in our country because of that polarization that you're describing. Now, I have a bias that it's not because of the history. I'm saying, I'll get to that when we have a moment. It's not the history that divides us. It's our respective beliefs about and views of that history and what needs to be done in light of it. So history isn't dividing us. What happened isn't dividing us. How we view it, I believe, is what divides us.
I think that's a good point. I was listening to a podcast the other day, and they were discussing, and this is one of the chapters you cover in your book when you talk about the fear of the feminine and subjugation of women. chapter, was interesting, and I want to bring it. I bring it up as a point to talk about fear and bias and bigotry, as you laid out earlier, the 9 elements. And what's interesting, it was a discussion around women's pay, and the discussion where uh, it was between NBA stars, and female WNBA player was talking about how she feels that the men should do more as far as step up to make sure that there's equality and pay. And she even said that she felt that some of the men should be willing to donate or sacrifice a portion of their salaries to really equal or kind of create some kind of balance, make it more equitable for women basketball players. And I thought that was very interesting perspective for her to say that, because when you study the history of the WNBA, you realize that it's lost money ever since it's been in inception. Even commissioner has come out and said, Alan Silverman, is that his name?
I know who you mean. I'm not. Don't quote me on a name either. Yeah.
Yeah, he said that the WNBA has lost $10 million. It loses $10 million every year that it's in existence. And then I've heard a comedian named Bill Barr talked about, he makes some good points, the fact that if you look at women who are feminists, he said feminists really wanted equal pay for WNBA players, then they should be filling the arenas. Like, they should fill those arenas with money as far as purchasing tickets, purchasing their jerseys, things of that nature, so that can generate the revenue to cover the women's expenses. And one of the players pushed back on the woman that was saying this, and he said, "You realize that the male players are the strongest advocates for the WNBA. We're always pushing, interviewing, talking, promoting, advocating for WNBA. And for you to say we should also have to give a portion of our salaries to make you all, to give you some equitable, just seems to be too far." And that's kind of where I'm going with my question. I wanted to set that context and use that as an example, is as we talk about, again, healing these narratives and looking at how we can begin to move forward as a society, it seems like we don't concern ourselves with making the pendulum in the middle. We seem like the pendulum, I'm just using this not as a political reference, but just as a reference with the pendulum. The pendulum was on the far left side first, and instead of trying to get in the middle, now it's really seem to be pushing it to the far right. Again, not a political reference, but just the reference of the imagining a pendulum moving left and right. So I just kind of wanted to see what your thoughts were, because you're a basketball coach around that. Not that you gotta let me know what your thoughts about equal women's pay when it comes to basketball, which I can't even see how that's even possible. Because again, a business, once you understand this business itself, you can't have equal pay if a business is not generating equal revenue. That's like saying if I create a hamburger company and then I create a fried chicken company, and I want to pay my employees equally, but my hamburger company generates billions of dollars and my chicken company only generates millions of dollars, I can't pay both employees the same amount of money. I got to pay you from what the revenue comes in. So I just kind of wanted to see what your thoughts were. How do we make sure that we don't swing too far when we try to make these adjustments? We don't swing too far either way and come up with a balance in the middle. Because I just feel like sometimes, and I'm just using an example, in this particular example specifically, I believe the women who are advocating for higher pay in WNBA, and they even talked about, for example, real quick before you respond, the WNBA player Brittany Griner, who's in Russia. Yep. And they were saying how she's in Russia because she's not making enough money to provide for her family, so she has to play overseas because she doesn't make enough money as a WNBA player. But then they talked about her salaries, or how her salaries as a WNBA player is $125,000 a year. And I just thought, wow, really? That's not enough? I mean, yeah, it's not enough compared to what LeBron makes, but she does not bring LeBron's type of attention. So if you compare her to the NBA players who generate the advertisement, the viewership, the selling out arenas, the jersey purchases, yeah, it's not there. But compared to do you have to play overseas to make your lifestyle comparable to put yourself in a situation where you can actually be jailed for what she is now? I just kind of wanted to see how do we make it equitable without really pushing one side too far, because what happens in that conversation is you're going to shut down. Like, I'm interested in creating equitable opportunities for women. When they use that as an extreme, it's like, no, I don't agree with you at all. I don't see how you all can justify receiving equal payments when women don't come out and support WNBA. Now, if women supported the WNBA, they were making millions and millions of dollars, then I would say yes, they should be paid equally and commensurate with the revenue they're generating from their league. But if your league is failing as a business model, and you can't come back to the men and say, bail us out from this because you're not treating us fair. So I just wanted to see what your thoughts were as far as that pendulum I was laying out earlier. I know that's a long question.
Yeah, no, I really believe that I think it's an important question, and I think it touches on many aspects of both history and current society and business. So the one thing I always like to remind myself of, and just because you mentioned I coached high school basketball in New York for 13 years. So I was in the Catholic High School League, which was one of the better leagues in the country. By the way, I mean, some of the guys on the some of the guys on the other teams, they didn't play for me, but some, and they've all, I'm out of that. But, people like Kenny Smith, Kenny Anderson, Chris Mullen, Mark Jackson, and before I was old enough to coach, a guy by the name of Lou Alcindor, they all came out of that same league, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. So it's a pretty competitive league. But, I was working in the Catholic school. My first year doing that, I was making, $8,000 as a full-time teacher and coach. But that's, back in the 70s. But more to the point, and I love sports. I don't watch a lot on TV anymore because I'm busy. And for me to sit and watch a 2 or 3 hour professional sporting game that's not the playoffs, I don't have the time to do that anymore. And I still have a lot of respect for people who perform at the highest levels. That said, I remind myself that professional sports is an entertainment business. It is. It's entertainment. And the income it receives is based on the culture's willingness to pay, either in person at an arena or to subscribe to, to watch shows so the advertisers will show up. It's all based on, and this is where I think it's really important, because you made this point, it's based on money. All right. And you're exactly right. So the big stars in the NBA get paid extraordinarily well because there's a big market. A lot of people want to watch them. The big stars in the WNBA, who in many, and they're two very different games, because in some ways the women play a more like a purer game in terms of how they move the ball and play as a team and pass and shoot. And I know I'll catch a lot of flack for saying that. But it's true. And for whatever reason, I mean, I'm sitting in Connecticut, about an hour and a half from the University of Connecticut. And it's not professional, but in Connecticut, college women's basketball is a big deal, as it is in other places like around.
They've won like the last 3-4 years in a row.
Yeah, and he's won, I think, 12 national championships. But that being said, for whatever reason, the women's game on a professional level doesn't have the same draw yet, perhaps, as the men's game. Now, from a business standpoint, your argument, I think, is valid. We can't pay you if what you're doing isn't bringing in income. We don't have the revenue to do that. That's true in every industry. All right. But here's where the history comes in. Women were kept out of education, kept out of the workforce, except for, teaching, primary school teaching primarily, and certain jobs in a hospital. I'm being general as I say this, for at least the first century and a half of this country. They didn't have access to what men have access to. It wasn't until the Education Acts of 1972, 71, that included what we now know as Title IX, that really was an equal right. It was an extension of the Equal Rights Act, of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and it got known as like giving women rights in sports, but that was just a small piece of it that got the most socially visible attention. But women have only really begun to get equal access to things that the government has anything to do with, public education being one of them, since the early to mid 70s. That's when it began. So women are still, playing catch up. And I would argue that if they hadn't been playing catch up, that perhaps the reception of the WNBA would be further along than, and the income would be different. Now, I can't prove that. That's me giving an opinion. So two things are at stake here. One is the residue of historical realities. And anybody who wants to argue that women always had equal rights, since the Big Bang, or at least since 1776 or 1619, wherever you want to put your marker down, I'll have that argument with anybody and come out on top, because they haven't.
Right.
They're still playing catch up. Where a woman saying to a man in the NBA, well, you should give me some of your money if you really believe in this, it's always kind of sketchy to tell anybody what they should do with their earnings. That's, anybody who wants to do that is going to do it. So it's a dilemma. But as long as, and this is I'm going to come full circle now, and this is part of where I respect what you do with and we're not saying conscious capitalism, we're saying spiritual capitalism. Yes, spiritual capital?
Correct.
So part of the problem in this country, I believe, is based on the unconscious, unfettered capitalist model, where the only measure of success is how much money you make. You're successful if you make a lot of money. Now, I know some phenomenal nurses, kept my parents alive, helped, as much as the doctors did. I know some gifted special ed teachers who nowadays get paid reasonably well, but they begin around $45,000 to $55,000 a year, and maybe can break six figures at the end of their 30-year careers. They're really successful people, but not in the entertainment business, not in professional sports, not in the big money places where you get rewarded by money. And again, professional sports, whether it's the WNBA, the NBA, the NFL, any of them, that's entertainment. Now, they're professional athletes, but it's an entertainment business. People pay to go watch. And we reward entertainers in this country more than we reward people who day in and day out help the ill, the elderly, our young children, etc. Now, just as for the asterisk next to that, I have a lot of respect for the best actors, the best singer-songwriters, musicians across genres of music, and for any professional athletes, for ballet dancers. I mean, you name it. Watching the best do what they do, especially since I played basketball. So when somebody plays it really well, I'm really tuned into that. So I'm not saying they shouldn't get paid well. In fact, was it Kurt Flood in baseball back in the St. Louis Cardinals? I might be getting this timing wrong, but he's the one that basically stepped forward and created free agency, because professional baseball players weren't getting much money back 60s and 70s. And I think it was in the 70s when he stepped up and he created free agency. He brought suit against the owners. The NBA, when I watched the Knicks win the 69-70 championship as a high school sophomore, those players weren't, they were getting paid well, probably closer to what Brittany Griner is making. But it wasn't until some years later, and it was during the, Bird, Magic, etc. years, and I forget the commissioner's name, where they really began to market the game in a good way, and they had these great rivalries. And then
David Stern.
Yeah, so Stern. did a really good job as the commissioner of the league, you know, and the players began to make more and more, and they, and then Michael Jordan came along, and all the guys since him, and so the league became a very successful entertainment business. And again, I'm not being deprecatory when I say entertainment business; it is that, um, and it really works. So I don't know what the move is. Maybe it's the ongoing, you know, awareness that we as Americans need to increasingly appreciate the women's game.
Well, and again, I don't want to make this our entire podcast about that. I just really want to talk about more so the behavior is where I was going with.
Hmm.
I was using that as an example because, see, to Bill Barr's point, why aren't more feminists more WNBA fans, and why don't they fill out those arenas and generate the revenue and attention? Like his point was this, and I don't know if it's true or not, but it does raise an interesting point to make me want to go out here and do a survey. He said most women can't even tell you the name of the team in their city, WNBA team in their city.
Yeah.
Let alone name 5 WNBA players.
Yeah.
So it's like here's a league that women wanted. It's created, supported financially by men, and then the women say, "Well, you still not giving me enough." And again, I just use that as a small reference point only to say it's the behaviors. It's like the same thing I would say with folks who argue because of discrimination that's happened in this country when it comes to um, paying black people.
Yeah.
And then some folks will argue they want equal outcomes. And see, I would push back against that as well. I would say I'm not for equal outcomes. I'm for equal opportunity. But if you don't step up and you don't do the work that someone else does, regardless of the race, your color, your skin, your gender, whatever, you should not get the same capital payoff that the person who did more work and brought more competence and improved themselves has done. There should not be equal outcomes. It should only be equal opportunities. So women have the opportunity to create their own league and support their own league. It's more women in this country than it is men. And there are definitely some women in leadership positions and companies that can come and sponsor, so they can really take over that and enhance that, and it won't be the disparity there as much. So I'm only pointing it out because that's where I'm seeing is as we begin to heal America's narratives, as you say, I just careful, and I just use women's example, but the same thing could be race, where people are advocating, well, um, like a minimum wage, pay a higher minimum wage, and I push back against that, mainly because to me, if you really study the history of this country and you're an entrepreneur and you're a business owner, you're telling me that the minimum wage, the minimum amount of money I can pay someone, the government sets at 15, $16 an hour that people are advocating for. I know it's not there now, but they want people to, and they say because you can't feed a family of four, you can't make a lifestyle. And the minimum wage was never created for that. It's called the minimum wage. For that reason, it's the lowest I can pay you based on the fact that you have no skills, no value that you're bringing me whatsoever. I as a business owner have to teach you and train you to even make it worth my value to me. And then at the point where you now have skills because I've invested in you beyond your payment, you now have the freedom to just leave and go somewhere else and get more money. And I'm stuck to repeat that same cycle over again. And so I can't compete. So what you do is you force me now to go hire labor overseas. So those are some of the things when I talk about that pendulum where it swings, that yes, we want to improve opportunities. We want to make more opportunities available. And that's where I'm really going with this as we talk about healing American narratives, that as we talk about the bigotry, the fear, the greed, the excess, the untrustworthiness, I think we have to begin to look at how do we make it equitable and not let someone who has been marginalized in the press say, well, I'm going to take it all the way to the extreme I want, and I'm going to advocate for mine, regardless if it's fair or just because I've been withheld and I've been subjugated or I've been oppressed for X amount of years. So I deserve to not have it. I need to have the ball and have the rights and choose. That's never going to bring a balance to this country or bring people who are opposed to your issue initially are never going to agree to your side if you're saying, well, you've had 80% of the pie. Now I want 80% of the pie because I want to catch up. I need 80% of the pie for the next 200 years, and then we'll be even. Even if you feel that's a just conversation in your mind, you got to understand that the other side will never agree to that, and we'll never get there.
Yeah, so a couple of things come up there, and I as we get further into like discussing the economy and small businesses, it's moving away from my area of expertise and experience. I want to just qualify by saying that. But a couple of things I'll say is, when it comes to small businesses, I mean, I tend to lean in more with your argument because, when they're just trying to, especially a startup, and I don't mean a tech startup that has $50 million of venture capital behind them, but somebody who's working their own local business, $15 an hour to pay people who they have to then train could be a lot and could make it hard for the business to do that. Different from entry-level positions in major corporations where they could definitely afford to pay somebody $15 an hour because the executives are making tens of millions of dollars in a given year. That's a bias that I have. I mean, the discrepancy between entry-level workers and CEOs, used to be, maybe 10 to 40 times, I think it was, more than, the lowest person on a totem pole would make. Now it's hundreds of times more. And I argue that has to do with greed. Once you pay me $75 million 1 year, and I don't need any more money. I mean, so. I'm saying, in that, even that number is ridiculous. So that's one piece. The second piece that I think is really important, and I just lost my train of thought for a moment on this, but in terms of the pendulum swinging, the example we began with the NBA, WNBA, and the entertainment industry, that's a different industry from a lot of other industries because it has to do with people being willing to show up and watch either virtually, or show up at the arenas and watch. And tying it back to women have proven, and I by no means do I think they're treated equally yet. But if you look at other entertainment businesses, to stay in that area with these arguments, I mean, women such as, I'll just do some contemporary ones now, Brandy Carlisle, Beyonce, and there's a lot of younger performers that I don't know the names of that I know that are doing really well, that are women. So the place has said, yeah, I will pay to come and watch you. I'll pay to buy your music. I'll pay to be entertained by you. And so what to drill down further, we can see it's not just about women per se, but it's about women in this industry, and it's the sports, and specifically the WNBA. And that gets into market analysis and stuff I know nothing about. But why is it that certain entertainers, be they professional actors and actresses, be they singer-songwriters, be they dancers who are women, have great market appeal, and the WNBA, which I think plays a great game, personally, in my opinion, doesn't? And that's the question, because it sounds as though it's less of a, this is women being held down again. I'm not saying there's none of that there, but more of why in this particular chunk of the market is this not being well received. The game is well received when men play it. Women are well received when they're talented singer-songwriters, musicians, actors, actresses, whatever. What is it about this specific example? And that's what I think needs to be looked at. But again, I'm no marketing guy. But to your point, the pendulum swinging thing, that's a tough one. And I think Bell Hooks spoke to that beautifully in her book. I just lost Outlaw Culture, Outlaw Justice, Outlaw Culture, I believe is the name of the book. But she basically pointed to the very thing you said. She said, I'm puzzled by, and she gave two specific examples. before she got to the heart of it. She said, I'm puzzled by the Black men who are on the front lines for racial equality. And she was speaking historically back, looking back into the 80s, 70s, and 60s, but don't really seem to support their sisters for equal rights for Black women and women in general. And I'm puzzled by white women who are on the front lines of gender equality, but don't seem to understand the racial inequalities of their Black sisters. And what Hook said was, any of us who are fighting and the particular domination that hurts us personally, be it gender, race, whatever, and ignores the larger, energies of domination that impact everyone, is really not doing the work that needs to be done. And then she said, we need an ethic of love where domination, whether it's ethnic, race, gender, orientation, this is me speaking now, not Bill, but where any domination is pushed back against. I agree with you that, fixed now and it has to serve me. And I feel there's a little side of me that's uncomfortable saying that. I'm agreeing with you, but as a 68-year-old heterosexual cisgendered white guy, who's never made a lot of money as a Catholic school teacher and a teaching poet. But it is true. If we can't measure forces that, to get to your points consistently in our conversations around replacing systems, then there's always going to be these little fights, which are probably necessary, but that are never going to really resolve the bigger issue, where a significant majority of people who are lower and middle class, and middle class is almost meaningless nowadays. I don't know what that really means anymore, who aren't really served by the systems. They're really not. It's easy to see that for people of color and for people who are discriminated against for orientation sexually or their sexual identities. But I make the argument that if we had done a better job with this for the last 4 decades, a disgruntled group of lower to middle income white people who felt left out would never have needed to vote for Donald Trump, who said he could resolve all the issues that they were upset about, because their jobs went overseas. They were trying to raise their kids and pay their bills, and they were losing their jobs, or their jobs got automated, and they couldn't keep up with the technological changes. So they felt, okay, here's an outsider who can solve it. He's a business guy. Had the politics of domination not kind of ignored that particular demographic for about 40 years, I argue that Donald Trump would never have had the grounds to become president. I mean, he didn't win the popular vote anyway. So I know I kind of took that in a different direction. But it's what we're talking about is a complex issue in my take on it, because it comes back to worldview. I mean, look at the Democrats and Republicans in the United States Senate and House of Representatives and the local elections, and the same issues of the economy and healthcare and education are on the table. And it's like they're from different planets. And that's worldview. For me, that's developmental worldview. Am I in it just for me? And this is an oversimplification of development, but it's the one I use. Is this just about me? Is it just about my group or my groups? Is it about all humans? And the vast majority of Americans don't live in that world at all, where it's about all of us. They don't. We don't. Some do, but most don't. Or is it about all that is? The whole planet, everybody on the planet and the planet itself. Virtually no Americans live there. And when I say virtually no, there's probably a few million who do, but that's a small number out of 300 million. So developmental worldview, how I see these issues, how any one of us sees these issues is the biggest obstacle, I believe, because the history is there. And anybody that wants to deny the history is probably stuck in a me-centric, it's all about me, or an us or group-centric worldview. Oh, I don't want to talk about that because that makes my group look bad. And that's a real problem. There's no magic way to help people grow developmentally that I know of.
And thank you for sharing that. And again, I brought my questions up not to really get into those economic conversations, but more so understanding how what has been, as you mentioned in your book, historically, folks have been marginalized, subjugated, whether it's women, African Americans, Native Americans, and now we're talking about healing. I want to talk about how we can make this healing process without trying to offend and take too much from the folks who may be open for the discussion. They may be saying, okay, you're right. Your book points out some great things, and maybe I do need to be more mindful and more conscious of my behaviors going forward as a result of why these people in these situations they're in and why they're advocating for such equal justice. However, when it's no longer equal justice that they're advocating anymore, and it becomes clear it's not equal, that's where we get to that masculine and feminine energy that you talk about in your book. But I know we're reaching in at the top of the hour, and I want to shift to now. What do you recommend can be some of the ways that folks who really want to explore how to become fully human and begin this healing process should do when they begin to get involved in these kind of discussions around ignorance, arrogance, bigotry, fear, violence, greed, bullying, and etc.
Yeah, so thanks for that. So in the language of the book, I refer to, in the very first chapter, I talk about cultural givens. And I speak about mine as an example. Not mine are not any better or worse than anybody else's, but cultural givens are basically, it's the map each of us is given when we're born. It comes primarily from our family of origin, our earliest teachers, our neighborhood, our religion, if we have one. And it's basically a map. And this is this is a map of the world that you're into. And by the time we're 7 to 10 years old, we have a pretty clear map of the world. And anybody who hears this should really go back and focus in on what was the map you were given when you were a kid, from birth to about 7 to 10 in that area, before you got to middle school and high school. Because you were grounded in a view of the world by the adults who influenced you. You were, and maybe by your experiences with those adults. Hopefully it was, healthy childhood. And then ask, to what extent have you questioned that view? Just as an example, I was born in 1954, second generation Italian-American, greater New York City, Catholic, and 9 years after World War II. So the culture, the television shows, and a lot of the books made it really clear that the Japanese and Germans were bad people, but they were trying to redeem themselves after World War II. So I'm just saying what I was given. The Catholic Church was the one true religion. And it was part of something called the Judeo-Christian, I laugh when I say this now, tradition, but the Jews refused to accept the Savior that God promised them, who was Jesus Christ. So, God still liked them, but not as much as he liked Catholics. That was effectively the message. And there was more to that. And so I joke, I have this whole list of cultural givens, and only 2 of them actually held up over time. One was the Yankees were the greatest team in baseball because they won more World Series championships. They just got slaughtered by the Houston Astros recently, but they still have the most. And I was also given that reading was a good thing to do. So those are the 2 that stood up over time in my life. So I would say to people, find your cultural givens and examine to what extent you've examined them so far. And if you haven't examined them, take a look at what you were given against your direct experience of your life. What have you really experienced? Is it true that these people are bad, or those people are better, or whatever it happens to be? Begin to do that, and then expose yourself to conversations or books or documentaries that feel uncomfortable for you. In other words, expose yourself to differing viewpoints, because that's how you grow. Not that you have to end up agreeing with them. You might you might read a book or go to a lecture or get in a conversation and leave it still disagreeing. Fine. but begin to allow yourself to hear other perspectives than your own and see how they fit and just observe. So explore your cultural givens and allow yourself to grow beyond any that are no longer valid or accurate. And very often, if I'm me-centric or group-centric, if I have my map, my cultural givens map, and I get challenged, very often I dig in deeper saying that my map is the correct one because I'm afraid. That's the fear piece. So I'm not looking over there because my map is right and it was right. My parents were right or my religion was right. And that's a dangerous place to live, because most of the things that we learn as young children that are given to us to help us navigate the world as young children no longer really apply as we grow into adulthood. Not all things. If you were taught to love other people, that one should never go away, obviously. If you're taught to be kind, right, that one should never go away. But there's lots of very specific, chronologically, geographically, and culturally given beliefs that need to be jettisoned in most cases, I have found. So everyone should practice their cultural givens and get back to us next week.
I'm gonna definitely work on practicing mine. So I know that I've definitely made some changes in
Yeah.
the ones I grew up with, but I learned that as long as you're alive, there's always growth. And being growth minded and being willing to look at yourself and see how you can change, I think is the essence of becoming fully human.
Yeah. And thank you for saying it that way, King, because this is my belief, and a lot of other people that I've come in contact with believe this as well. I believe that you finish your growth just after your final breath. And for those people who believe in reincarnation, maybe it continues beyond that. I don't have any direct evidence of that yet, so I'm open to it. But you don't finish until you die, as far as I know. It's great. Wow, look what I learned today. I thought I was done. I thought I finished, and I learned something new. And what a great feeling that is to see a bigger, deeper perspective on the world. We need that.
Absolutely, absolutely. Now we reached the point of the show where we want to share who we believe who exhibited the fully human behavior characteristics that we're advocating. And so you want to go first, Reggie, with who you feel has been someone that you want to mention?
Yeah, sure. And I didn't think that ahead of time. So a thought came up, and I'm going to just trust myself. I hope it doesn't make you uncomfortable. So, I'm going to point to you. My experience with you over these last, I think we're going on 5 to 6 months of knowing each other, but I just experienced you as a fully human being, who, as you said, who's into ongoing learning, who's really serving people in the local community in Baltimore where you chose to live, who is open to having conversations with a wide variety of people. You're not just stuck with me, I know that, about a lot of different topics. And I think that you are an exemplar for that. You practice what we're talking about. So I hope it doesn't make you uncomfortable. I'm going to point to you as an example of what it means to be fully human.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that.
So take that, King.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. It doesn't make me uncomfortable, but it does. I look at that as something I got to live up to. I wouldn't put myself there yet, but I would definitely say I'm on the journey for sure, and I'm committed to that task. I appreciate you pointing that out. I would say mine would be. I don't know if I said this before, but it's worth mentioning again if I did, is be Harriet Tubman. And Harriet Tubman is because, again, and I choose the people that I select because of ones who saw an injustice, took action, regardless of the financial or potential harm to themselves, physically, emotionally, spiritually, that has came as a result of taking their actions. They still took it anyway. And for Harriet Tubman to do what she did as a woman, and then at her age to make over 396 trips back into the South when she escaped and never got caught, never was called, and they had the best slave catchers in the country chasing her. I mean, I can't even imagine someone at that level, true superhero, and truly someone who was fully human. Because not only did she do that, she didn't stop there, which was truly enough for anyone in their lifetime to do. She went on to become a spy for the Union Army. She went on to become so many other great things she's done. And to me, I could only hopefully aspire to just do 1/10 of the greatness he did. And to me, that's what I really believe, that when you achieve the fully human level, your spirit, which I believe lives on anyway. I believe that, this physical shell that we live in, like I say, if you weigh a body within the first 3 minutes after someone has passed, the body still weighs exactly the same. So what it means is that the spirit has no weight to it. And so when you really live fully human, your spirit still stays in the consciousness of people, even though it's always out there in the ethers. But if you exhibit a fully human life, then your spirit stays visible. You're talked about, you recognize, your picture's there. So you're still there in the consciousness of the world, regardless of how long it's been since you actually physically made that transition. So with that being said, again, Reggie, I want to thank you for your investment of time and energy, and for writing a book that gives us the context we were talking about, and making sure that you've exhibited fully human by taking the time and investment in writing this book on these topics that needed to be addressed. And I want to thank you for putting forth that effort, because, like I said, you took action. You were someone who had this in your soul and your spirit, and instead of you just putting it off, you decided, I'm going to take sacrifices. I'm going to put this out there. I'm going to put myself beyond my comfort level and marketing, and bring this to the world. And I wish you much more success as we go forth.
Thank you, King. Thank you.
And listening audience, thank you for tuning in for another hour of our discussion on Fully Human. Again, we're not saying you have to agree with everything we're saying. We're not saying that we're right in everything we bring up. All we're saying is that we are committed to the conversations, and committed to growth, and committed to change, and committed to be on a journey to become fully human. And hopefully you all take heed to Reggie's advice, examine your cultural givens. And next week, we look forward to hearing anyone who wants to share what they come up with. And so until then, we wish everyone a blessed and productive week. Thank you, Reggie.
Thank you, King.
Thank you, listening audience.